Hey everyone, this is lecture 8.1, Theories of Social Change. This is really important content. Arguably, I could just start the course off on this stuff, but I made a couple other strategic learning decisions, so this is where we are right now. So, we're going to talk about what social change is, we're going to talk about why does it happen, and we're going to talk about what happens, how do individuals respond when change does indeed happen. So, and this is just something I harp on, so if you've heard this before, please, I don't know, stare at the wall or something. But we tend to use the word theory incorrectly in our day-to-day language. But the reality of the matter is there is a difference between a theory and a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea that can be tested, and a theory is a statement of scientific fact. When there is a theory, there is an abundance of knowledge associated with it. Thus, a theory is more than just some dumb idea you have. A theory, what you say, well, I have a theory about that. You might have a hypothesis about it, but you almost definitely don't have a theory. The example I always use is you say to your brother who's drinking too much, I have a theory you're going to be hungover in the morning. Reality, knowing your brother, knowing how alcohol works, you have a hypothesis that your brother's going to be hungover. It is not a statement of scientific reality that your brother will indeed be hungover in the morning. So, sociologists define social change as the transformation of a culture over time. This can be unplanned and unintentional, and certainly a great degree of social change is unintentional, but the social change probably that's most interesting to sociologists is deliberate and intentional. And when it is deliberate and intentional, it usually occurs with a organization of some kind driving it. And it should also be pointed out that deliberate change tends to be surrounded by more controversy. Certainly, when there is great unintentional change, there can be some controversy, but the huge controversy comes from unintentional change. I'm sorry, with intentional change. Now, collective behavior is absolutely a major part of intentional social change. Collective behavior doesn't have to be part of social change, but it is indeed, it's a factor. Any behavior that groups of people engage in is by definition collective. It may or may not be coordinated. So we might not be doing this collective behavior on purpose. It may or may not occur at the same place or the same time, especially in the modern internet era. Change, we can do things, the word asynchronously, right? Because you lived through COVID. And then participation in social movements are by definition a form of collective behavior. Collective behavior is not a kind of social movement, it's the other way around. So there are several ways that change can occur. I already laid this out very briefly. In terms of unintentional change, we have major physical events such as a hurricane, an earthquake. COVID was such a element of unintentional change. There were, sure, societal responses and actually social movements tied in with nonsensical societal responses. But overall, no one meant for that wild virus to happen, regardless of what nonsense conspiracy theories may say. The aging of the baby boomers is a really excellent example of unintentional change. Yes, this is human behavior, but it is not unintentional. These people simply have gone through their lives doing the things that to them as individuals made sense in their lives. And some of those changes were actually pretty cool. Others of those changes kind of devastating to those who weren't in that demographic. Intentional changes then are things like discoveries and inventions, right? Microchips are a really great example there. The advent of computing that happens using computer technology, what we considered modern computer technology, as opposed to vacuum tubes, that was huge. That shaped the 21st century. Additionally, then, the internet and the forms how we communicate in our day-to-day lives. Pharmaceuticals, often, and obviously, pharmaceutical corporations do tend to be absolutely horrid, but without those innovations, there are a lot of ways that the way our society behaves has been changed. And then, probably the most controversial of uh, intentional change occurs when oppressed groups attempt to seek justice, and of course, what is oppressed, what is justice, often is, if not necessarily a matter of opinion, then certainly argued about. Things like Black Lives Matter, that very righteous cause, which actually, what BLM is doing right now is a very interesting question. Is there activity happening? There is, but anyway, as you can tell, I get sidetracked by this topic very well. The LGBTQ plus rights movement, the work of unions, both in the past and in the present in the United States, these are all very good examples, not the only things, but examples of social change that is driven by groups trying to make the world a better place. Now, most social problems and most social dilemmas and all that social everythings is caused by problems tied with what would happen if everybody in society did this thing that might make plenty of sense for one individual. This Let's put it a different way. You can do a behavior that makes perfect sense for you, but if everyone does that behavior, then it creates big, big problems. Now, if you are in Central Ohio right now, you might not suffer this quite as much as people in other places. I have a lot of family in Pittsburgh, and I will tell you this is a daily issue. People in Boston and New York also had to deal with this. Traffic. You may feel that traffic is not good in the city of Columbus, and I will tell you that it is absolutely child's play compared to the horror that is traffic in Pittsburgh. It's actually I love Pittsburgh dearly, but it's one of the reasons I decided that, well, maybe I want to not lose 2 hours of my life every single day to traffic. Traffic is an example. I could physically get from my house to OSU to my classroom, if I so desired, maybe 10 minutes max, if it weren't for traffic, if it weren't for those other people that wanted to be to those places that they wanted to be in 10 minutes max, right? That is a social dilemma. We can't all have that thing that we want. So even, but in us trying to do the thing we want, in driving like maniacs and speeding and cutting people off, the reality of the matter is that actually only makes traffic worse, as good as it feels to us to cut that asshole off. But traffic is a social dilemma. It would not exist if it not for all those other pricks that are in our way. There you go. And most pollution, specifically, and almost every other problem tied with the environment can also be tied back to social dilemmas of this sort. Now, there are two types of social dilemmas that are very commonly related to the environment. We have the tragedy of the commons dilemma and the public goods dilemma. Often, the tragedy of the commons dilemma is not fully presented because it is an interesting idea, but there are kind of some flaws to the logic there. The public goods dilemma does tend to be a little bit more straightforward. So the tragedy of the commons dilemma was first identified by Garrett Hardin in 1968. It should be noted that Hardin was an economist and 1968 was not our current era, so the way we think about some things certainly have changed. The tragedy of the commons occurs when many individuals overexploit a public resource for personal gain and they deplete or degrade that resource. That term, personal gain, there really should be used relatively loosely. Um, it could just be for personal existence, quite frankly. Yes, absolutely. There are big, very greedy, highly privileged individuals who would exploit a resource in this paradigm, but truly, um, everyday people can also, for sure, be guilty of this, unfortunately. The tragedy of the commons dilemma is where littering, where most forms of pollution or harming the environment comes from in terms of the problem there. There are many really good examples of the tragedy of the commons. I find if we're going to talk about the actions of individuals, like just like normal people, the horrendous pollution of the Ganges River in India is a really tragic example of the tragedy of the commons. The Ganges is the largest river in India. If you're familiar with like how big and wide the Mississippi is, if you've actually, the Mississippi is actually a really big river. I know, shocker. The Ganges is much bigger than the Mississippi, and as such, because of the population density of India, the Ganges is critical for the survival of millions of people, billions maybe. However, with all those people living beside it, it has become intensely polluted. Yes, there are factories that dump into the Ganges too, but it is just the sheer mass of people living by the Ganges has created a tremendous pollution problem. Then you compound on it the fact that the Ganges is a holy river to to most Hindus. You always have to say most Hindus because Hinduism is actually an intensely diverse religion, as I've rambled about. Um, so we have people who are bathing in this river. They are treating it as if it is holy and good and righteous. And from their spiritual metaphysical standpoint, yes, that is their belief structure. But it also contains chemicals and pathogens and microorganisms that could kill them. It is truly not only a tragedy of physical living, but also a tragedy of religiosity. It's horrible. And with that said, though, there have been some really great progress made in trying to clean up the Ganges. I do give that credit to the Indian government in that regard. If you ever do go to India, though, and you do bathe in the Ganges, I mean, if that's what you went there for, do it. But honestly, take a shower afterward. It's really sad, and I find it deeply unfortunate. Anyway, so moving on to the tragedy of the commons, some more. Actually, we've been talking about tragedy of the commons. Sorry. If a farmer, where does this name come from, right? It comes from talking about collective property as it existed in Europe prior to the modern era. That's where the commons was that collective property. It doesn't exist anymore in India. I'm sorry, we're talking about Europe now. It doesn't exist anymore in Europe. It is a it's a thought experiment at this point, honestly. So, you're a farmer. We have this collective property. And the collective property's purpose truly is to allow you to do the farm stuff you need to do when you're not where you live, right? So the commons, the area that was most frequently called the commons, was like an area just outside of town or maybe inside town. You can maybe think of like a public square or something, or in college campus terms, like a quad or the oval. And you just let your sheep be there while you are in town, maybe drinking a pint at the pub, or doing trading or grocery shopping or whatever, right? You could just let your sheep chill there for a bit. Well, if though one of the many farmers that uses this area just lets their animals chill forever on the commons, then they'll eat up all the commons, right? And if a handful of farmers do that, not just one jerk, then it'll get destroyed pretty quick, right? This as a thought exercise is a really good example of individualism versus communitarianism. So it is a good way to talk about resources in our modern era, but the idea definitely has its flaws, and this is not a dilemma that we as a society cannot change to work ourselves around. It should be pointed out that the tragedy of the commons dilemma makes the assumption that all people in a society will be inherently individualistic, even if, that humans are inherently individualistic. And that is actually a relatively modern problem. It simply is a modern problem. We are Individualism can be harmful or it can be helpful. Where it is harmful is that we don't take the consideration of our communities into our day-to-day life decisions, but just by default. That's really what we're talking about here. Truly, this should be called the tragedy of individualism. Really, would be a better term of it, because if we all respect the commons, if we have a mindset of, well, you have to respect the commons, then it wouldn't be a tragedy. So, to kind of emphasize why it is so ethnocentric, um, it really it looks like when we talk about the tragedy of the commons that this is, a problem for, those dumb shepherds, and aren't they silly and stupid, those farmers, and why would they trust each other that way? What a bunch of rubes. The reality of the matter is that our Mr. Economist, who came up with this idea, did not understand those hurting communities, right? If you look at communities of pastoral people, you would know that they don't put up with that bullshit. They don't put up with one jerk messing up the commons for everyone, right? And in those societies, if you piss off everybody by messing it up for everybody, you will be punished by everybody. Keeping in mind that societies like this tend not to have centralized court systems, it really is much more of a everybody is allowed to take the law into their own hands as long as they are following the law, right? Oh, you are messing up the commons, then I'm allowed to take one of your sheep, right? Something along that is an exact that's not a perfect way of putting it, but herders don't put up with that nonsense. That's just simply all it is. So truly, it is not a tragedy of farming communities. It is a tragedy present in our modern world. And if we made an effort to be different, or at least form communities that were different, we could, if we wanted to, be different. The public goods dilemma. This occurs when individuals must contribute to a collective resource even though they might not directly benefit from it. So this is moving on from the next thing of the tragedy of the commons dilemma. Insurance is a form of public goods dilemma that we are all put in. We all have types of insurance, at least I hope you do, that hopefully we won't need, right? Car insurance is a stupid. It's a very wise, but it's a bad bet. If you, almost all of us who pay for car insurance are going to wind up paying more for a thing that we probably won't use. But if you don't have insurance, not only are you breaking the law, which that is an issue, please have car insurance. But if you don't have car insurance, you're legally liable for the entire cost of the money of the damage that you did, right? So we're not just talking about your car, we're not just talking about the other person's car. We're talking about like damage you do to city property, damage you do to somebody's house. God forbid you might kill somebody, you're liable for that as well if you don't have car insurance. That is what we're talking about there. So the dilemma is that all of us need to buy into insurance to make it make sense, but the collective property, the collective good of it may not be immediately obvious to you, which is why we have laws requiring people to have car insurance. Taxes, similarly, may not be obvious to many people, and that's part of the contributing to the fact that Americans are, now there certainly are taxes that are dumb, but most Americans simply don't understand what happens with their tax money, and as a result, part of our collective American mindset is that we inherently hate taxes, and that is true to a certain degree. But I think a lot of people would hate taxes a whole lot less if they actually understood where that money was going toward. As I alluded to this already, we have a real big problem with taxes in our country in terms of really understanding it. This is an issue, an environmental issue, because the way many countries deal with trying to encourage people to drive less is by raising automotive taxes or raising gasoline taxes. If you're not super familiar, petrol is the British term for oil. But actually, it's the British term for gasoline, I think. I don't know. Who knows? One can never know. Why I wouldn't. I could ask someone who's British, but whatever. I have a number of friends who are British. So we see here, and illustrated quite well, we in the United States have incredibly low taxes in terms of gasoline, namely because they're politically unpopular. But countries like the Netherlands, France, Germany, UK, Spain, Canada, who drive much, much less, part of the reasons they drive much less is because it's more expensive to drive, because there are taxes on those gasolines. Gasolines? Sure. Now, I want to point out, though, that the Netherlands, France, Germany, UK, I don't know about Spain in this regard. All of those countries have very, very good public transit systems. They have subways that work, right? The United States, barring a couple cities, doesn't have functioning public transit, and also Canada, in many, not all places, but in many places, is similar to us in basically the lack of public trains. So, if not for the American hesitancy to tax gasoline, I would say that we might be more in similar to Canada, but we see there, if we really look at it, Canadian gas taxes are, what's that? That almost looks like triple to what they are to American gas taxes. And I also want to, wait, let me see. Yeah, I think these tax rates are still relatively current, even though it's from 2011. So gas prices have gone up rather substantially, but the rate of tax remains the same there. So what happens when change happens? Well, social change is more than just getting one event started, what's sometimes called the catalyzing moment, or the trigger moment, or whatever you want to call it, the vanguard moment. It is a process, right? So there is the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre that triggered the American Revolution, but there were things that led up to that, and there were many things that happened after it. 1776 was not the end or beginning of the American Revolution. It was about a decade, maybe even, it depends on where you draw that line, honestly. History is not as fine cut as we think it is. So how individuals react to the change is part of the change process, and those reactions are not always rational, because keep in mind, when we talk about social change, we are talking about social processes, and we are talking about the behaviors of human beings, and you know very well as a human being that human beings are not always rational. Social change often causes micro-level disruption. Often this takes the form of rioting or protest. These disruptions are actually pretty accurately described by two very useful social theories, that of contagion theory and that of emergent norm theory. Contagion theory does not give very much credit to the capacity of the individual to make their own decisions. Contagion theory is all about the ability of the social environment to change an individual's behavior, which is both frightening and troubling. But there is something to it. It states that individuals who join a crowd or a mob or a group, because what is a mob, what is a riot other than a social construct declared by police or city officials, they become infected by that mentality, by that bad judgmenting. And thus, if you are in a big crowd of people, and that crowd of people just suddenly starts breaking windows or setting things on fire, this states that you also may start doing that thing. And you say to yourself, I wouldn't just do that because everyone else is. My mom told me that if everyone jumped off a bridge, would you? And the social scientific answer to that is possibly, actually. Really, this is not a great theory for explaining self-interest, but it is really good for explaining groups of people who have been somehow altered, which is my second bullet there. What has happened to these people in this riot is the question that you should ask when you hear about rioting or looting or any of those words that are sometimes used. How have they been altered? Have they had kind of a simmering anger for decades, as was the case with the Watts riots in LA, and then what were called the LA riots surrounding the Rodney King beating, police brutality incident in the early 1990s. Those people in those riots were altered by systemic racial oppression. Are people hungry? Are these people starving? Are they in danger? Are they afraid? Are they drunk? Celebratory rioting is a really interesting phenomena in this regard. This is the reason why people trash their cities after they win a sporting championship. And I say sporting championship because it's football, it's baseball. In Canada, it's often hockey. It's in Europe, it is soccer. Like, it can be all kinds of things. I don't know if there's ever been a riot over, like, gymnastics, but there has to have been. People get really excited, and they get to be in a big group of people, and then, as humans do, they're intoxicated, and then, after a whole night of drinking, setting stuff on fire sounds really, really fun, right? That's the cause of that. So contagion theory is remarkably good at explaining this behavior, but when it comes to the behavior of maybe intentional social movement behavior of, say, what is happening at a protest, and how does a protest either stay peaceful or go violent? Contagion theory sucks at that. Emergent norm theory is really good for explaining protest rallies. Emergent norm theory states that individual members of a crowd make their own decisions about behavior, and then collective norms in that group are created through others' acceptance or rejections of those behaviors. Basically, what we have here is, what kind of protest is this going to be happening? Is this going to be a violent protest, or is this going to be a peaceful protest? In the late 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War movement was a big deal in a big deal. It was huge in the United States, and there were many moments in that movement that could have gone one way or could have gone the other way. Famously, I need to look it up. I don't remember where this was exactly, but famously, there were National Guard, a battalion of National Guard soldiers? Yeah, National Guard people or soldiers were set up against a bunch of peace protesters, and one of those peace protesters put a flower in the barrel of one of the soldiers, and as like a, not like a, it was like a kind gesture, almost a, hey, you can stop it. It was actually quite moving if you read about it, but, and context is critical, right? And in that moment, then the soldiers, who were the same age, these were all college students, put down their guns, and they kind of just walked away. They said, we're not going to do this. But then at the Kent State riot, at the Kent State massacre in, I believe it was 1972, the National Guard opened fire and killed, I think it was five people. 5 people, almost identical circumstances. The whole flower in the gun thing was not there, right? But individuals made individual decisions. Somebody put down their gun first. Somebody fired first. And then when that one thing happens, everyone else makes their individual decision. I am going to also fire, or I am going to also put down my gun. And that's how protests go, or any kind of collective micro-level movement goes from one thing to the other. Change also impacts people not directly involved in social movements. Culture lag absolutely applies to this. It refers to a time between changes in material culture or technology and the resulting changes in the broader culture's relative values, meanings, laws, and norms. This was very, very well illustrated by this was very well illustrated by the way people wore COVID masks at first, and the way certain people wore COVID masks the whole way through the lockdowns. Um, I saw as things were going on, and I'm guilty of a few things too. I was wearing my mask backwards, like with the blue side inside, for too long, right? Before actually students corrected me on it. Um, so at first, though, there were a lot of really good intending people just kind of wearing their masks wrong, right? And then eventually there was willful obstinance of people just being idiots and not caring about themselves or others too. But in those first couple months of people learning how to use masks, which unfortunately were probably the most dangerous time, people were just trying to figure the thing out, right? That was a moment of culture lag. And then by the end of it, most of us got really good at wearing masks, right? And existing in areas to try to minimize disease. And that is why it ended. If you look at a lot of it's actually still remarkable at the time of recording this anyway, and I'll get to this by the time this is. Anyway, I'm definitely going to re-record this by the time what I'm talking about is irrelevant. But there were projections that COVID was going to be around for like 10 years completely. We were going to be in hard lockdown for like a decade. There were projections saying that. And we have had no way to disprove it or prove it. It was just if people continued to refuse to mask and continued to refuse to social distance, and if we were unable to develop a vaccine and if people didn't actually get vaccinated, it could have lasted a hell of a lot longer, actually. And it is actually quite remarkable how fast we were able to recover from that horrible, horrible thing that we all lived through. So good for us, actually. It doesn't feel like it. It felt horrible and felt like it was way too long. But there, at the end of this century, they're going to look back on that pandemic response in particular, and I'm pretty confident they're going to say, wow, that was actually pretty amazing. Again, it didn't feel like it at the time. Well, and I just got somebody trying to call me, and this is time for me to end anyway. So thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to you looking forward to watching the next one.